He'll flog 'em in the good old style. But for that there'd be nothing for it but to give it all up and run away."
Obviously the landowner was chaffing Sviazhsky, who, far from resenting it, was apparently amused by it.
"But you see, we manage our land without such extreme measures," he said, smiling. "Levin and I, and this gentleman."
He indicated the other landowner.
"Yes, the thing's done at Mikhail Petrovitch's, but ask him how it's done." "Do you call that a rational system?" said the landowner, obviously rather proud of the word rational. "My system's very simple," said Mikhail Petrovitch. "Thank God. All my management rests on getting the money ready for the autumn taxes, and the peasants come to me, 'Father, master, help us.' Well, the peasants are all one's neighbours, one feels for them. So one advances them a third, but one says, 'Remember, lads, I have helped you, and you must help me when I need it, whether it's the sowing of the oats, or the hay cutting, or the harvest.' And, well, one agrees. So much for each taxpayer, though there are dishonest ones among them too, it's true."
Levin, who had been long familiar with these patriarchal methods, exchanged glances with Sviazhsky and interrupted Mikhail Petrovitch, turning again to the gentleman with the grey whiskers. "Then what do you think?" he asked. "What system is one to adopt nowadays?"
"Why, manage like Mikhail Petrovitch, or let the land for half the crop or for rent to the peasants. That one can do. Only that's just how the general prosperity of the country is being ruined. Where the land with serf labour and good management gave a yield of 9-1, on the half-crop system it yields 3-1. Russia has been ruined by the emancipation."
Sviazhsky looked with smiling eyes at Levin and made a faint gesture of irony to him, but Levin did not think the landowner's words absurd. He understood them better than he did Sviazhsky. A great deal more of what the gentleman with the grey whiskers said to show in what way Russia was ruined by the emancipation struck him indeed as very true, new to him, and quite incontestable. The landowner unmistakably spoke his own individual thought, a thing that very rarely happens, and a thought to which he had been brought not by a desire of finding some exercise for an idle brain, but a thought which had grown up out of the conditions of his life, which he had brooded over in the solitude of his village and had considered in every aspect.
"The point is, don't you see, that progress of every sort is only made by the use of authority," he said,
evidently wishing to show he was not without culture.
"Take the reforms of Peter, of Catherine, of Alexander. Take European history, and progress in agriculture more than anything else. The potato, for instance, that was introduced among us by force. The wooden plough, too, wasn't always used. It was introduced maybe in the days before the Empire, but it was probably brought in by force. Now, in our days, we landowners in the serf times used various improvements in our husbandry, drying machines and thrashing machines, and carting manure and all the modern implements. All that we brought into use by our authority, and the peasants opposed it at first and ended it by imitating us. Now, by the abolition of serfdom, we've been deprived of our authority, and so our husbandry, where it had been raised to a high level, is bound to sink to the most savage primitive condition. That's how I see it."
"But why so? If it's rational, you'll be able to keep up the same system with hired labour," said Sviazhsky.
"We've no power over them. With whom am I going to work the system, allow me to ask?"
There it is, the labour force, the chief element in agriculture, thought Levin.
"With labourers. The labourers won't work well and won't work with good implements. Our labourer can do nothing but get drunk like a pig, and when he's drunk he ruins everything you give him. He makes the horses ill with too much water, cuts good harness, barters the tires of the wheels for drink, drops bits of iron into the thrashing machine so as to break it. He loathes the sight of everything that's not after his fashion, and that's how it is the whole level of husbandry has fallen. Land's gone out of cultivation, overgrown with weeds, or divided among the peasants, and where millions of bushels were raised, you get 100,000. The wealth of the country has decreased. If the same thing had been done, but with care that—"
And he proceeded to unfold his own scheme of emancipation by means of which these drawbacks might have been avoided. This did not interest Levin, but when he had finished, Levin went back to his first position, and addressing Sviazhsky, and trying to draw him into expressing his serious opinion, that the standard of culture is falling, and that with our present relations to the peasants there is no possibility of farming on a rational system to yield a profit, that's perfectly true, said he.
I don't believe it,
Sviazhsky replied quite seriously.
All I see is that we don't know how to cultivate the land, and that our system of agriculture in the serf days was by no means too high, but too low. We have no machines, no good stock, no efficient supervision. We don't even know how to keep accounts. Ask any landowner. He won't be able to tell you what crop's profitable and what's not. Italian bookkeeping, said the gentleman of the grey whiskers ironically. You may keep your books as you like, but if they spoil everything for you, there won't be any profit. Why do they spoil things? A poor thrashing machine or your Russian presser they will break, but my steam press they don't break. A wretched Russian nag they'll ruin, but keep good dray horses, they won't ruin them, and so it is all round. We must raise our farming to a higher level. Oh, if only one had the means to do it, Nikolai Ivanovitch. It's all very well for you, but for me, with a son to keep at the university, lads to be educated at the high school, how am I going to buy these dray horses? Well, that's what the land banks are for. To get what's left me sold by auction? No, thank you. I don't agree that it's necessary or possible to raise the level of agriculture still higher, said Levin. I devote myself to it, and I have means, but I can do nothing. As to the banks, I don't know to whom they're any good. For my part, anyway, whatever I've spent money on in the way of husbandry, it has been a loss. Stock, a loss. Machinery, a loss. That's true enough, the gentleman with the grey whiskers chimed in, positively laughing with satisfaction. And I am not the only one, pursued Levin. I mix with all the neighbouring landowners who are cultivating their land on a rational system. They all, with rare exceptions, are doing so at a loss. Come, tell us, how does your land do? Does it pay? Said Levin, and at once in Sviazhsky's eyes he detected that fleeting expression of alarm which he had noticed whenever he had tried to penetrate beyond the outer chambers of Sviazhsky's mind. Moreover, this question on Levin's part was not quite in good faith. Madame Sviazhskaya had just told him at tea that they had that summer invited a German expert in bookkeeping from Moscow, who, for a consideration of 500 rubles, had investigated the management of their property, and found it was costing them a loss of 3,000-odd rubles. She did not remember the precise sum, but it appeared that the German had worked it out to the fraction of a farthing. The grey-whiskered landowner smiled at the mention of the profits of Sviazhsky's farming, obviously aware how much gain his neighbour and marshal was likely to be making. Possibly it does not pay, answered Sviazhsky. That merely proves either that I'm a bad manager or that I've sunk my capital for the increase of my rents. Oh, rent, Levin cried with horror. Rent there may be in Europe, where land has been improved by the labour put into it. But with us all the land is deteriorating from the labour put into it. In other words, They're working it out, so there's no question of rent. How no rent? It's a law. Then we're outside the law. Rent explains nothing for us, but simply muddles us. No. Tell me how there can be a theory of rent. Will you have some junket? Masha, pass us some junket or raspberries. He turned to his wife. Extraordinarily late the raspberries are lasting this year. In the happiest frame of mind, Sviazhsky got up and walked off, apparently supposing the conversation to have ended at the very point when to Levin it seemed it was only just beginning. Having lost his antagonist, Levin continued the conversation with the grey-whiskered landowner, trying to prove to him that all the difficulty arises from the fact that we don't find out the peculiarities and habits of our labourer. But the landowner, like all men who think independently and in isolation, was slow in taking in any other person's idea, and particularly partial to his own. He stuck to it that the Russian peasant is a swine and likes swinishness, and that to get him out of his swinishness one must have authority, and there is none. One must have the stick, and we have become so liberal that we have all of a sudden replaced the stick that served us for 1,000 years by lawyers and model prisons, where the worthless, stinking peasant is fed on good soup and has a fixed allowance of cubic feet of air. What makes you think, said Levin, trying to get back to the question, that it's impossible to find some relation to the labourer in which the labour would become productive? That never could be so with the Russian peasantry. We've no power over them, answered the landowner. How can new conditions be found? Said Sviazhsky. Having eaten some junket and lighted a cigarette, he came back into the discussion. All possible relations to the labour force have been defined and studied, he said. The relic of barbarism, the primitive commune with each guarantee for all, will disappear of itself. Serfdom has been abolished. There remains nothing but free labour, and its forms are fixed and ready-made and must be adopted. Permanent hands, day labourers, farmers. You can't get out of those forms. But Europe is dissatisfied with those forms. Dissatisfied and seeking new ones, and we will find them in all probability. That's just what I was meaning, answered Levin. Why shouldn't we seek them for ourselves? Because it would be just like inventing afresh the means for constructing railways. They are already invented. But if they don't do for us, if they're stupid, said Levin. And again he detected the expression of alarm in the eyes of Sviazhsky. Oh, yes, we'll bury the world under our caps. We found the secret Europe was seeking for. I've heard all that. But excuse me, do you know all that's been done in Europe on the question of the organization of labour? No, very little. That question is now absorbing the best minds in Europe. The Schultz-Delitzsch movement, and then all this enormous literature of the labour question, the most liberal Lassalle movement, the Mulhausen experiment. That's a fact by now, as you're probably aware. I have some idea of it, but very vague. No, you only say that. No doubt you know all about it as well as I do. I'm not a professor of sociology, of course, but it interested me, and really, if it interests you, you ought to study it. But what conclusion have they come to? Excuse me. The two neighbours had risen, and Sviazhsky, once more checking Levin in his inconvenient habit of peeping into what was beyond the outer chambers of his mind, went to see his guests out. Chapter 28. Levin was insufferably bored that evening with the ladies. He was stirred as he had never been before by the idea that the dissatisfaction he was feeling with his system of managing his land was not an exceptional case,
but the general condition of things in Russia. That the organization of some relation of the laborers to the soil in which they would work, as with the peasants he had met halfway to the Sviazhskys, was not a dream, but a problem which must be solved. And it seemed to him that the problem could be solved, and that he ought to try and solve it. After saying good night to the ladies, and promising to stay the whole of the next day, so as to make an expedition on horseback with them to see an interesting ruin in the Crown Forest, Levin went, before going to bed, into his host's study to get the books on the labour question that Sviazhsky had offered him. Sviazhsky's study was a huge room, surrounded by bookcases with 2 tables in it. One, a massive writing table, standing in the middle of the room, the other, a round table covered with recent numbers of reviews and journals in different languages, ranged like the rays of a star round the lamp. On the writing table was a stand of drawers marked with gold lettering, and full of papers of various sorts. Sviazhsky took out the books and sat down in a rocking chair. "What are you looking at there?" he said to Levin, who was standing at the round table looking through the reviews. "Oh, yes, there's a very interesting article here," said Sviazhsky of the review Levin was holding in his hand. "It appears," he went on, with eager interest, "that Friedrich was not, after all, the person chiefly responsible for the partition of Poland. It is proved—" And with his characteristic clearness he summed up those new, very important and interesting revelations. Although Levin was engrossed at the moment by his ideas about the problem of the land, he wondered, as he heard Sviazhsky, what is there inside of him? And why is he interested in the partition of Poland? When Sviazhsky had finished, Levin could not help asking, "Well, and what then?" But there was nothing to follow. It was simply interesting that it had been proved to be so and so. But Sviazhsky did not explain, and saw no need to explain why it was interesting to him. "Yes, but I was very much interested by your irritable neighbour," said Levin, sighing. "He's a clever fellow, and said a lot that was true." "Oh, get along with you. An inveterate supporter of serfdom at heart, like all of them," said Sviazhsky. "Whose marshal you are." "Yes, only I marshal them in the other direction," said Sviazhsky, laughing. "I'll tell you what interests me very much," said Levin. "He's right that our system, that's to say of rational farming, doesn't answer, that the only thing that answers is the money-lender system, like that meek-looking gentleman's, or else, the very simplest, whose fault is it? Our own, of course. Besides, it's not true that it doesn't answer. It answers with Vassilchikov. A factory? But I really don't know what it is you're surprised at. The people are at such a low stage of rational and moral development that it's obvious they're bound to oppose everything that's strange to them. In Europe, a rational system answers because the people are educated. It follows that we must educate the people, that's all. But how are we to educate the people? To educate the people, 3 things are needed: schools, and schools, and schools. But you said yourself that people are at such a low stage of material development. What help are schools for that? Do you know, you remind me of the story of the advice given to the sick man. You should try purgative medicine. Taken. Worse. Try leeches. Tried them. Worse. Well, then there's nothing left but to pray to God. Tried it. Worse. That's just how it is with us. I say political economy, you say worse. I say socialism, worse. Education, worse. But how do schools help matters? They give the peasants fresh wants. Well, that's a thing I've never understood, Levin replied with heat. In what way are schools going to help the people to improve their material position? You say schools. Education will give them fresh wants. So much the worse, since they won't be capable of satisfying them. And in what way a knowledge of addition and subtraction and the catechism is going to improve their material condition I never could make out. The day before yesterday, I met a peasant woman in the evening with a little baby, and asked her where she was going. She said she was going to the wise woman. Her boy had screaming fits, so she was taking him to be doctored. I asked, "Why, how does the wise woman cure screaming fits?" She puts the child on the hen roost and repeats some charm. Well, you're saying it yourself. What's wanted to prevent her taking her child to the hen roost to cure it of screaming fits is just, Sviazhsky said, smiling good-humouredly. Oh, no, said Levin with annoyance. That method of doctoring I merely meant as a simile for doctoring the people with schools. The people are poor and ignorant. That we see as surely as the peasant woman sees the baby is ill because it screams. But in what way this trouble of poverty and ignorance is to be cured by schools is as incomprehensible as how the hen roost affects the screaming. What has to be cured is what makes him poor. Well, in that at least you're in agreement with Spencer, whom you dislike so much. He says, too, that education may be the consequence of greater prosperity and comfort, of more frequent washing, as he says, but not of being able to read and write. Well, then, I'm very glad, or, the contrary, very sorry, that I'm in agreement with Spencer, only I've known it a long while. Schools can do no good. What will do good is an economic organization in which the people will become richer, will have more leisure, and then there will be schools. Still, all over Europe now, schools are obligatory. And how far do you agree with Spencer yourself about it? Asked Levin. But there was a gleam of alarm in Sviazhsky's eyes as he said, smiling, No, that screaming story is positively capital. Did you really hear it yourself? Levin saw that he was not to discover the connection between this man's life and his thoughts. Obviously he did not care in the least what his reasoning led him to. All he wanted was the process of reasoning. And he did not like it when the process of reasoning brought him into a blind alley. That was the only thing he disliked, and avoided by changing the conversation to something agreeable and amusing. All the impressions of the day, beginning with the impression made by the old peasant, which served, as it were, as the fundamental basis of all the conceptions and ideas of the day, threw Levin into violent excitement. This dear good Sviazhsky, keeping a stock of ideas simply for social purposes, and obviously having some other principles hidden from Levin, while with the crowd, whose name is Legion, he guided public opinion by ideas he did not share. That irascible country gentleman, perfectly correct in the conclusions that he had been worried into by life, but wrong in his exasperation against a whole class, and that the best class in Russia. His own dissatisfaction with the work he had been doing, and the vague hope of finding a remedy for all this, all was blended into a sense of inward turmoil and anticipation of some solution near at hand. Left alone in the room assigned him, lying on a spring mattress that yielded unexpectedly at every movement of his arm or his leg, Levin did not fall asleep for a long while. Not one conversation with Sviazhsky, though he had said a great deal that was clever, had interested Levin, but the conclusions of the irascible landowner required consideration. Levin could not help recalling every word he had said, and in imagination amending his own replies. Yes, I ought to have said to him, "You say that our husbandry does not answer because the peasant hates improvements, and that they must be forced on him by authority. If no system of husbandry answered at all without these improvements, you would be quite right. But the only system that does answer is when the labourer is working in accordance with his habits, just as the old peasants land halfway here. Your and our general dissatisfaction with the system shows that either we are to blame or the labourers. We have gone our way, the European way, a long while without asking ourselves about the qualities of our labour force. Let us try to look upon the labour force not as an abstract force, but as the Russian peasant, with his instincts, and we shall arrange our system of culture in accordance with that. Imagine, I ought to have said to him, that you have the same system as the old peasant has, that you have found means of making your labourers take an interest in the success of the work, and have found the happy mean in the way of improvements which they will admit, and you will, without exhausting the soil, get twice or 3 times the yield you got before. Divide it in halves, give half as the share of labour, the surplus left you will be greater, and the share of labour will be greater too. And to do this one must lower the standard of husbandry and interest the labourers in its success. How to do this? That's a matter of detail, but undoubtedly it can be done. This idea threw Levin into a great excitement. He did not sleep half the night, thinking over in detail the putting of his idea into practice. He had not intended to go away next day, but he now determined to go home early in the morning. Besides, the sister-in-law with her low-necked bodice aroused in him a feeling akin to shame and remorse for some utterly base action. Most important of all, he must get back without delay. He would have to make haste to put his new project to the peasants before the sowing of the winter wheat, so that the sowing might be undertaken on a new basis. He had made up his mind to revolutionize his whole system. Chapter 29. The carrying out of Levin's plan presented many difficulties, but he struggled on, doing his utmost, and attained a result which, though not what he desired, was enough to enable him, without self-deception, to believe that the attempt was worth the trouble. One of the chief difficulties was that the process of cultivating the land was in full swing, that it was impossible to stop everything and begin it all again from the beginning, and the machine had to be mended while in motion. When on the evening that he arrived home he informed the bailiff of his plans, the latter, with visible pleasure, agreed with what he said, so long as he was pointing out that all that had been done up to that time was stupid and useless. The bailiff said that he had said so a long while ago, but no heed had been paid him. But as for the proposal made by Levin, to take a part as shareholder with his labourers in each agricultural undertaking, at this the bailiff simply expressed a profound despondency and offered no definite opinion, but began immediately talking of the urgent necessity of carrying the remaining sheaves of rye the next day, and of sending the men out for the second ploughing, so that Levin felt that this was not the time for discussing it. On beginning to talk to the peasants about it, and making a proposition to cede them the land on new terms, he came into collision with the same great difficulty that they were so much absorbed by the current work of the day, that they had not time to consider the advantages and disadvantages of the proposed scheme. The simple-hearted Ivan, the cowherd, seemed completely to grasp Levin's proposal, that he should, with his family, take a share of the profits of the cattle-yard, and he was in complete sympathy with the plan. But when Levin hinted at the future advantages, Ivan's face expressed alarm and regret that he could not hear all he had to say, and he made haste to find himself some task that would admit of no delay. He either snatched up a fork to pitch the hay out of the pens, or ran to get water, or to clear out the dung. Another difficulty lay in the invincible disbelief of the peasant that a landowner's object could be anything else than a desire to squeeze all he could out of them. They were firmly convinced that his real aim, whatever he might say to them, would always be in what he did not say to them, and they themselves, in giving their opinion, said a great deal, but never said what was their real object. Moreover, Levin felt that the irascible landowner had been right. The peasants made their first and unalterable condition of any agreement whatever that they should not be forced to any new methods of tillage of any kind, nor to use new implements. They agreed that the modern plough ploughed better, and that the scarifier did the work more quickly, but they found thousands of reasons that made it out of the question for them to use either of them. And though he had accepted the conviction that he would have to lower the standard of cultivation, he felt sorry to give up improved methods, the advantages of which were so obvious. But in spite of all these difficulties, he got his way, and by autumn the system was working, or at least so it seemed to him. At first, Levin had thought of giving up the whole farming of the land just as it was to the peasants, the labourers, and the bailiff on new conditions of partnership, but he was very soon convinced that this was impossible, and determined to divide it up. The cattle yard, the garden, hayfields, and arable land, divided into several parts, had to be made into separate lots. The simple-hearted cowherd, Ivan, who, Levin fancied, understood the matter better than any of them, collecting together a gang of workers to help him, principally of his own family, became a partner in the cattle yard. A distant part of the estate, a tract of waste land that had lain fallow for 8 years, was, with the help of the clever carpenter, Fyodor Reezyunov, taken by 6 families of peasants on new conditions of partnership, and the peasant, Shureyev, took the management of all the vegetable gardens on the same terms. The remainder of the land was still worked on the old system, but these 3 associated partnerships were the first step to a new organization of the whole, and they completely took up Levin's time. It is true that in the cattle yard things went no better than before, and Ivan strenuously opposed warm housing for the cows and butter made of fresh cream, affirming that cows require less food if kept cold, and that butter is more profitable made from sour cream, and he asked for wages just as under the old system, and took not the slightest interest in the fact that the money he received was not wages, but an advance out of his future share in the profits. It is true that Fyodor Reezyunov's company did not plough over the ground twice before sowing, as had been agreed, justifying themselves on the plea that time was too short. It is true that the peasants of the same company, though they had agreed to work the land on new conditions, always spoke of the land not as held in partnership, but as rented for half the crop, and more than once the peasants and Reezyunov himself said to Levin, "If you would take a rent for the land it would save you trouble, and we should be more free." Moreover, the same peasants kept putting off on various excuses the building of a cattle yard and barn on the land as agreed upon, and delayed doing it till the winter. It is true that Shureyev would have liked to let out the kitchen gardens he had undertaken in small lots to the peasants. He evidently quite misunderstood, and apparently intentionally misunderstood, the conditions upon which the land had been given to him. Often, too, talking to the peasants and explaining to them all the advantages of the plan, Levin felt that the peasants heard nothing but the sound of his voice, and were firmly resolved, whatever he might say, not to let themselves be taken in. He felt this especially when he talked to the cleverest of the peasants, Reezyunov, and detected the gleam in Reezyunov's eyes which showed plainly both ironical amusement at Levin and the firm conviction that, if anyone were to be taken in, it would not be he, Reezyunov. But in spite of all this, Levin thought the system worked, and that by keeping accounts strictly and insisting on his own way, he would prove to them in the future the advantages of the arrangement, and then the system would go of itself. These matters, together with the management of the land still left on his hands, and the indoor work over his book, so engrossed Levin the whole summer that he scarcely ever went out shooting. At the end of August he heard that the Oblonskys had gone away to Moscow, from their servant who brought back the side-saddle. He felt that in not answering Darya Alexandrovna's letter he had by his rudeness, of which he could not think without a flush of shame, burned his ships, and that he would never go and see them again. He had been just as rude with the Sviazhskys, leaving them without saying goodbye, but he would never go to see them again either. He did not care about that now. The business of reorganizing the farming of his land absorbed him as completely as though there would never be anything else in his life. He read the books lent him by Sviazhsky, and copying out what he had not got, he read both the economic and socialistic books on the subject, but as he had anticipated, found nothing bearing on the scheme he had undertaken. In the books on political economy, in Mill, for instance, whom he studied first with great ardour, hoping every minute to find an answer to the questions that were engrossing him, he found laws deduced from the condition of land culture in Europe. But he did not see why these laws, which did not apply in Russia, must be general. He saw just the same thing in the socialistic books. Either they were the beautiful but impractical fantasies which had fascinated him when he was a student, or they were attempts at improving, rectifying the economic position in which Europe was placed, with which the system of land tenure in Russia had nothing in common. Political economy told him that the laws by which the wealth of Europe had been developed, and was developing, were universal and unvarying. Socialism told him that development along these lines led to ruin. And neither of them gave an answer, or even a hint, in reply to the questions that he, Levin, and all the Russian peasants and landowners were to do with their millions of hands and millions of acres to make them as productive as possible for the common weal. Having once taken the subject up, he read conscientiously everything bearing on it, and intended in the autumn to go abroad to study land systems on the spot, in order that he might not on this question be confronted with what so often met him on various subjects. Often, just as he was beginning to understand the idea in the mind of anyone he was talking to, and was beginning to explain his own, he would suddenly be told, "But Kaufmann, but Jones, but Dubois, but Micheli. You haven't read them. They've thrashed that question out thoroughly." He now saw distinctly that Kaufmann and Micheli had nothing to tell him. He knew what he wanted. He saw that Russia has splendid land, splendid labourers, and that in certain cases, as at the peasants on the way to Sviazhsky's, the produce raised by the labourers and the land is great. In the majority of cases, when capital is applied in the European way, the produce is small, and that this simply arises from the fact that the labourers want to work and work well only in their own peculiar way, and that this antagonism is not incidental but invariable, and has its roots in the national spirit. He thought that the Russian people, whose task it was to colonize and cultivate vast tracts of unoccupied land, consciously adhered, till all their land was occupied, to the methods suitable to their purpose, and that their methods were by no means so bad as was generally supposed. And he wanted to prove this theoretically in his book and practically on his land. Chapter 30. At the end of September, the timber had been carted for building the cattle yard on the land that had been allotted to the Association of Peasants, and the butter from the cows was sold and the profits divided. In practice, the system worked capitally, or at least so it seemed to Levin. In order to work out the whole subject theoretically and to complete his book, which, in Levin's daydreams, was not merely to effect a revolution in political economy, but to annihilate that science entirely and to lay the foundation of a new science of the relation of the people to the soil, all that was left to do was to make a tour abroad, and to study on the spot all that had been done in the same direction, and to collect conclusive evidence that all that had been done there was not what was wanted. Levin was only waiting for the delivery of his wheat to receive the money for it and go abroad. But the rains began, preventing the harvesting of the corn and potatoes left in the fields, and putting a stop to all work, even to the delivery of the wheat. The mud was impassable along the roads. 2 mills were carried away, and the weather got worse and worse. On the 30th of September the sun came out in the morning, and hoping for fine weather, Levin began making final preparations for his journey. He gave orders for the wheat to be delivered, sent the bailiff to the merchant to get the money owing him, and went out himself to give some final directions on the estate before setting off. Having finished all his business, soaked through with the streams of water which kept running down the leather behind his neck and his gaiters, but in the keenest and most confident temper, Levin returned homewards in the evening. The weather had become worse than ever towards evening. The hail lashed the drenched mare so cruelly that she went along sideways, shaking her head and ears, but Levin was all right under his hood, and he looked cheerfully about him at the muddy streams running under the wheels, at the drops hanging on every bare twig, at the whiteness of the patch of unmelted hailstones on the planks of the bridge, at the thick layer of still juicy, fleshy leaves that lay heaped up about the stripped elm tree. In spite of the gloominess of nature around him, he felt peculiarly eager. The talks he had been having with the peasants in the further village had shown that they were beginning to get used to their new position. The old servant to whose hut he had gone to get dry evidently approved of Levin's plan, and of his own accord proposed to enter the partnership by the purchase of cattle. "I have only to go stubbornly on towards my aim, and I shall attain my end," thought Levin. "And it's something to work and take trouble for. This is not a matter of myself individually. The question of the public welfare comes into it. The whole system of culture, the chief element in the condition of the people, must be completely transformed. Instead of poverty, general prosperity and content. Instead of hostility, harmony and unity of interests. In short, a bloodless revolution, but a revolution of the greatest magnitude, beginning in the little circle of our district, then the province, then Russia, the whole world. Because a just idea cannot but be fruitful. Yes, it's an aim worth working for. And it's being me, Kostya Levin, who went to a ball in a black tie, and was refused by the Shtcherbatskaya girl, and who was intrinsically such a pitiful, worthless creature, that proves nothing. I feel sure Franklin felt just as worthless, and he too had no faith in himself, thinking of himself as a whole. That means nothing. And he too, most likely, had an Agafea Mikhailovna to whom he confided his secrets. Musing on such thoughts, Levin reached home in the darkness. The bailiff, who had been to the merchant, had come back and brought part of the money for the wheat. An agreement had been made with the old servant, and on the road the bailiff had learned that everywhere the corn was still standing in the fields, so that his 160 shocks that had not been carried were nothing in comparison with the losses of others. An agreement had been made with the old servant, and on the road the bailiff had learned that everywhere the corn was still standing in the fields, so that his 160 shocks that had not been carried were nothing in comparison with the losses of others. After dinner, Levin was sitting, as he usually did, in an easy chair with a book, and as he read he went on thinking of the journey before him in connection with his book. Today, all the significance of his book rose before him with special distinctness, and whole periods ranged themselves in his mind in illustration of his theories. "I must write that down," he thought. "That ought to form a brief introduction, which I thought unnecessary before." He got up to go to his writing table, and Laska, lying at his feet, got up too, stretching and looking at him as though to inquire where to go. But he had not time to write it down, for the head peasants had come round, and Levin went out into the hall to them. After his levee, that is to say, giving directions about the labour of the next day, and seeing all the peasants who had business with him, Levin went back to his study and sat down to work. Laska lay under the table. Agafea Mikhailovna settled herself in her place with her stocking. After writing for a little while, Levin suddenly thought with exceptional vividness of Kitty, her refusal, and their last meeting. He got up and began walking about the room. "What's the use of being dreary?" said Agafea Mikhailovna. "Come, why do you stay on at home? You ought to go to some warm springs, especially now you're ready for the journey." "Well, I am going away the day after tomorrow, Agafea Mikhailovna. I must finish my work." There, your work, you say, as if you hadn't done enough for the peasants. Why, as 'tis, they're saying, your master will be getting some honour from the Tsar for it. Indeed, and it is a strange thing. Why need you worry about the peasants?" "I'm not worrying about them. I'm doing it for my own good." Agafea Mikhailovna knew every detail of Levin's plans for his land. Levin often put his views before her in all their complexity, and not uncommonly he argued with her and did not agree with her comments. But on this occasion she entirely misinterpreted what he had said. "Of one's soul's salvation we all know, and must think before all else," she said with a sigh. "Parfen Denisitch now, for all he was no scholar, he died a death that God grant every one of us the like," she said, referring to a servant who had died recently. "Took the sacrament and all." "That's not what I mean," said he. "I mean that I'm acting for my own advantage. It's all the better for me if the peasants do their work better." "Well, whatever you do, if he's a lazy good-for-naught, everything'll be at 6s and 7s. If he has a conscience, he'll work, and if not, there's no doing anything." "Oh, come, you say yourself Ivan has begun looking after the cattle better." "All I say is," answered Agafea Mikhailovna, evidently not speaking at random but in strict sequence of idea, "that you ought to get married. That's what I say." Agafea Mikhailovna's allusion to the very subject he had only just been thinking about hurt and stung him. Levin scowled, and without answering her he sat down again to his work, repeating to himself all that he had been thinking of the real significance of that work. Only at intervals he listened in the stillness to the click of Agafea Mikhailovna's needles, and recollecting what he did not want to remember, he frowned again. At 9 o'clock they heard the bell and the faint vibration of a carriage over the mud. "Well, here's visitors come to us, and you won't be dull," said Agafea Mikhailovna, getting up and going to the door. But Levin overtook her. His work was not going well now, and he was glad of a visitor, whoever it might be. Chapter 31. Running halfway down the staircase, Levin caught a sound he knew, a familiar cough in the hall. But he heard it indistinctly through the sound of his own footsteps, and hoped he was mistaken. Then he caught sight of a long, bony, familiar figure, and now it seemed there was no possibility of mistake. And yet he still went on hoping that this tall man, taking off his fur cloak and coughing, was not his brother Nikolai. Levin loved his brother, but being with him was always a torture. Just now, when Levin, under the influence of the thoughts that had come to him, and Agafea Mikhailovna's hint, was in a troubled and uncertain humour, the meeting with his brother that he had to face seemed particularly difficult. Instead of a lively, healthy visitor, some outsider who would, he hoped, cheer him up in his uncertain humour, he had to see his brother, who knew him through and through, who would call forth all the thoughts nearest his heart, would force him to show himself fully, and that he was not disposed to do. Angry with himself for so base a feeling, Levin ran into the hall. As soon as he had seen his brother close, this feeling of selfish disappointment vanished instantly and was replaced by pity. Terrible as his brother Nikolai had been before in his emaciation and sickliness, now he looked still more emaciated, still more wasted. He was a skeleton covered with skin. He stood in the hall, jerking his long, thin neck and pulling the scarf off it, and smiled a strange and pitiful smile. When he saw that smile, submissive and humble, Levin felt something clutching at his throat. "You see, I've come to you," said Nikolai in a thick voice, never for 1 second taking his eyes off his brother's face. "I've been meaning to a long while, but I've been unwell all the time. Now I'm ever so much better," he said, rubbing his beard with his big, thin hands. "Yes, yes," answered Levin, and he felt still more frightened when, kissing him, he felt with his lips the dryness of his brother's skin and saw close to him his big eyes full of a strange light. A few weeks before, Konstantin Levin had written to his brother that through the sale of the small part of the property that had remained undivided, there was a sum of about 2,000 rubles to come to him as his share. Nikolai said that he had come now to take this money and, what was more important, to stay a while in the old nest, to get in touch with the earth, so as to renew his strength like the heroes of old for the work that lay before him. In spite of his exaggerated stoop and the emaciation that was so striking from his height, his movements were as rapid and abrupt as ever. Levin led him into his study. His brother, dressed with particular care, a thing he never used to do, combed his scanty, lank hair, and, smiling, went upstairs. He was in the most affectionate and good-humoured mood, just as Levin often remembered him in childhood. He even referred to Sergei Ivanovitch without rancour. When he saw Agafea Mikhailovna, he made jokes with her and asked after the old servants. The news of the death of Parfen Denisitch made a painful impression on him. A look of fear crossed his face, but he regained his serenity immediately. "Of course, he was quite old," he said, and changed the subject. "Well, I'll spend a month or 2 with you, and then I'm off to Moscow. Do you know, Myakov has promised me a place there, and I'm going into the service. Now I'm going to arrange my life quite differently," he went on. "You know I got rid of that woman." "Maria Nikolaevna? Why? What for?" "Oh, she was a horrid woman. She caused me all sorts of worries." But he did not say what the annoyances were. He could not say that he had cast off Maria Nikolaevna because the tea was weak, and above all because she would look after him as though he were an invalid. "Besides, I want to turn over a new leaf completely now. I've done silly things, of course, like everyone else, but money's the last consideration. I don't regret it, so long as there's health, and my health, thank God, is quite restored." Levin listened and racked his brains, but could think of nothing to say. Nikolai probably felt the same. He began questioning his brother about his affairs, and Levin was glad to talk about himself, because then he could speak without hypocrisy. He told his brother of his plans and his doings. His brother listened, but evidently he was not interested by it. These 2 men were so akin, so near each other, that the slightest gesture, the tone of voice, told both more than could be said in words. Both of them now had only one thought, the illness of Nikolai and the nearness of his death, which stifled all else. But neither of them dared to speak of it, and so whatever they said, not uttering the one thought that filled their minds, was all falsehood. Never had Levin been so glad when the evening was over and it was time to go to bed. Never with any outside person, Never on any official visit had he been so unnatural and false as he was that evening, and the consciousness of this unnaturalness and the remorse he felt at it made him even more unnatural. He wanted to weep over his dying, dearly loved brother, and had to listen and keep on talking of how he meant to live. As the house was damp and only one bedroom had been kept heated, Levin put his brother to sleep in his own bedroom behind a screen. His brother got into bed, and whether he slept or did not sleep, tossed about like a sick man, coughed, and when he could not get his throat clear, mumbled something. Sometimes, when his breathing was painful, he said, "Oh, my God!" Sometimes, when he was choking, he muttered angrily, "Ah, the devil!" Levin could not sleep for a long while, hearing him. His thoughts were of the most various, but the end of all his thoughts was the same: death. Death, the inevitable end of all, for the first time presented itself to him with irresistible force. And death, which was here in this loved brother, groaning half asleep, and from habit calling without distinction on God and the devil, was not so remote as it had hitherto seemed to him. It was in himself too, he felt that. If not today, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, in 30 years. Wasn't it all the same? And what was this inevitable death? He did not know, had never thought about it, and what was more, had not the power, had not the courage to think about it. I work, I want to do something, but I had forgotten it must all end. I had forgotten death. He sat on his bed in the darkness, crouched up, hugging his knees, and holding his breath from the strain of thought, he pondered. But the more intensely he thought, the clearer it became to him that it was indubitably so, that in reality, looking upon life, he had forgotten one little fact, that death will come, and all ends, that nothing was even worth beginning, and that there was no helping it anyway. Yes, it was awful, but it was so. But I am alive still. Now what's to be done? What's to be done? He said in despair. He lighted a candle, got up cautiously and went to the looking-glass and began looking at his face and hair. Yes, there were grey hairs about his temples. He opened his mouth. His back teeth were beginning to decay. He bared his muscular arms. Yes, there was strength in them. But Nikolai, who lay there breathing with what was left of lungs, had had a strong, healthy body too. And suddenly he recalled how they used to go to bed together as children, and how they only waited till Fyodor Bogdanitch was out of the room to fling pillows at each other and laugh irrepressibly, so that even their awe of Fyodor Bogdanitch could not check the effervescing, over-brimming sense of life and happiness. And now that bent, hollow chest, and I, not knowing what will become of me, or wherefore. Ha! Ha! Damnation! Why do you keep fidgeting? Why don't you go to sleep? His brother's voice called to him. Oh, I don't know. I'm not sleepy. I've had a good sleep. I'm not in a sweat now. Just see. Feel my shirt. It's all wet, isn't it? Levin felt, withdrew behind the screen and put out the candle, but for a long while he could not sleep. The question how to live had hardly begun to grow a little clearer to him, when a new, insoluble question presented itself. Death. Why, he's dying. Yes, he'll die in the spring, and how help him? What can I say to him? What do I know about it? I'd even forgotten that it was at all. Chapter 32. Levin had long before made the observation that when one is uncomfortable with people from their being excessively amenable and meek, one is apt very soon after to find things intolerable from their touchiness and irritability. He felt that this was how it would be with his brother. And his brother Nikolai's gentleness did in fact not last out for long. The very next morning he began to be irritable, and seemed doing his best to find fault with his brother, attacking him on his tenderest points. Levin felt himself to blame, and could not set things right. He felt that if they had both not kept up appearances, but had spoken, as it is called, from the heart, that is to say, had said only just what they were thinking and feeling, they would simply have looked into each other's faces, and Constantine could only have said, "You're dying, you're dying," and Nikolai could only have answered, "I know I'm dying, but I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid." And they could have said nothing more if they had said only what was in their hearts. But life like that was impossible, and so Constantine tried to do what he had been trying to do all his life, and never could learn to do, though, as far as he could observe, many people knew so well how to do it, and without it there was no living at all. He tried to say what he was not thinking, but he felt continually that it had a ring of falsehood, that his brother detected him in it and was exasperated at it. The third day Nikolai induced his brother to explain his plan to him again, and began not merely attacking it, but intentionally confounding it with communism. "You've simply borrowed an idea that's not your own, but you've distorted it, and are trying to apply it where it's not applicable. But I tell you it's nothing to do with it. They deny the justice of property, of capital, of inheritance, while I do not deny this chief stimulus." Levin felt disgusted at himself at using such expressions, but ever since he had been engrossed by his work, he had unconsciously come more and more frequently to use words not Russian. "All I want is to regulate labor." "Which means you've borrowed an idea, stripped it of all that gave it its force, and want to make believe that it's something new," said Nikolai, angrily tugging at his necktie. "But my idea has nothing in common—" "That, anyway," said Nikolai Levin, with an ironical smile, his eyes flashing malignantly, "has the charm of, what one's to call it, geometrical symmetry, of clearness, of definiteness. It may be a utopia, but if once one allows the possibility of making all the past a tabula rasa, no property, no family, then labor would organize itself. But you gain nothing. Why do you mix things up? I've never been a communist." "But I have, and I consider it premature but rational, and it has a future, just like Christianity in its first ages. All that I maintain is that the labor force ought to be investigated from the point of view of natural science. That is to say, it ought to be studied, its qualities ascertained. But that's utter waste of time. That force finds a certain form of activity of itself, according to the stage of its development. There have been slaves first everywhere, then metiers. Then we have half the crop system, rent and day laborers. What are you trying to find?" Levin suddenly lost his temper at these words, because at the bottom of his heart he was afraid that it was true that he was trying to hold the balance ever between communism and the familiar forms, and that this was hardly possible. "I am trying to find means of working productively for myself and for the laborers. I want to organize," he answered hotly. "You don't want to organize anything. It's simply just as you've been all your life, that you want to be original, to pose as not exploiting the peasants simply, but with some idea in view." "Oh, all right. That's what you think, and let me alone," answered Levin, feeling the muscles of his left cheek twitching uncontrollably. "You never had, and never have convictions. All you want is to please your vanity." "Oh, very well.
Then let me alone. And I will let you alone. And it's high time I did. And go to the devil with you. And I'm very sorry I ever came."
In spite of all Levin's efforts to soothe his brother afterwards, Nikolai would listen to nothing he said, declaring that it was better to part, and Constantine saw that it simply was that life was unbearable to him. Nikolai was just getting ready to go when Constantine went in to him again and begged him, rather unnaturally, to forgive him if he had hurt his feelings in any way.
"Ah, generosity," said Nikolai, and he smiled. "If you want to be right, I can give you that satisfaction. You're in the right, but I'm going all the same."
It was only just at parting that Nikolai kissed him and said, looking with sudden strangeness and seriousness at his brother,
"Anyway, don't remember evil against me, Kostya,"
and his voice quivered. These were the only words that had been spoken sincerely between them. Levin knew that those words meant,
"You see, and you know, that I'm in a bad way, and maybe we shall not see each other again."
Levin knew this, and the tears gushed from his eyes. He kissed his brother once more, but he could not speak, and knew not what to say. 3 days after his brother's departure, Levin too set off for his foreign tour. Happening to meet Shtcherbatsky, Kitty's cousin, in the railway train, Levin greatly astonished him by his depression.
"What's the matter with you?" Shtcherbatsky asked him.
"Oh, nothing. There's not much happiness in life."
"Not much? You come with me to Paris instead of to Mulhausen. You shall see how to be happy."
"No, I've done with it all. It's time I was dead."
"Well, that's a good one," said Shtcherbatsky, laughing. "Why, I'm only just getting ready to begin."
"Yes, I thought the same not long ago, but now I know I shall soon be dead." Levin said what he had genuinely been thinking of late. He saw nothing but death or the advance towards death in everything. But his cherished scheme only engrossed him the more. Life had to be got through somehow till death did come. Darkness had fallen upon everything for him. But just because of this darkness he felt that the one guiding clue in the darkness was his work, and he clutched at it and clung to it with all his strength. Part 4. Chapter 1. The Karenins, husband and wife, continued living in the same house, met every day, but were complete strangers to one another. Alexey Alexandrovitch made it a rule to see his wife every day, so that the servants might have no grounds for suppositions, but avoided dining at home. Vronsky was never at Alexey Alexandrovitch's house, but Anna saw him away from home, and her husband was aware of it. The position was one of misery for all three, and not one of them would have been equal to enduring this position for a single day if it had not been for the expectation that it would change, that it was merely a temporary painful ordeal which would pass over. Alexey Alexandrovitch hoped that this passion would pass, as everything does pass, that everyone would forget about it, and his name would remain unsullied. Anna, on whom the position depended, and for whom it was more miserable than for anyone, endured it because she not merely hoped, but firmly believed that it would all very soon be settled and come right. She had not the least idea what would settle the position, but she firmly believed that something very soon would turn up now. Vronsky, against his own will or wishes, followed her lead, hoping too that something apart from his own action would be sure to solve all difficulties. In the middle of the winter, Vronsky spent a very tiresome week. A foreign prince who had come on a visit to Petersburg was put under his charge, and he had to show him the sights worth seeing. Vronsky was of distinguished appearance. He possessed, moreover, the art of behaving with respectful dignity, and was used to having to do with such grand personages. That was how he came to be put in charge of the prince, but he felt his duties very irksome. The prince was anxious to miss nothing of which he would be asked at home had he seen that in Russia, and on his own account he was anxious to enjoy to the utmost all Russian forms of amusement. Vronsky was obliged to be his guide in satisfying both these inclinations. The mornings they spent driving to look at places of interest. The evenings they passed enjoying the national entertainments. The prince rejoiced in health, exceptional even among princes. By gymnastics and careful attention to his health he had brought himself to such a point that in spite of his excess in pleasure he looked as fresh as a big, glossy green Dutch cucumber. The prince had travelled a great deal, and considered one of the chief advantages of modern facilities of communication was the accessibility of the pleasures of all nations. He had been in Spain, and there had indulged in serenades and had made friends with a Spanish girl who played the mandolin. In Switzerland he had killed chamois. In England he had galloped in a red coat over hedges and killed 200 pheasants for a bet. In Turkey he had got into a harem. In India he had hunted on an elephant, and now in Russia he wished to taste all the specially Russian forms of pleasure. Vronsky, who was, as it were, chief master of the ceremonies to him, was at great pains to arrange all the Russian amusements suggested by various persons to the prince. They had race-horses, and Russian pancakes, and bear hunts, and 3-horse sledges, and gypsies, and drinking feasts, with Russian accompaniment of broken crockery. And the prince, with surprising ease, fell in with the Russian spirit, smashed trays full of crockery, sat with a gypsy girl on his knee, and seemed to be asking, "What more? And does the whole Russian spirit consist in just this?" In reality, of all the Russian entertainments, the prince liked best French actresses and ballet dancers and white seal champagne. Vronsky was used to princes, but either because he had himself changed of late, or that he was in too close proximity to the prince, that week seemed fearfully wearisome to him. The whole of that week he experienced a sensation such as a man might have set in charge of a dangerous madman, afraid of the madman, and at the same time, from being with him, fearing for his own reason. Vronsky was continually conscious of the necessity of never for a second relaxing the tone of stern official respectfulness, that he might not himself be insulted. The prince's manner of treating the very people who, to Vronsky's surprise, were ready to descend to any depths to provide him with Russian amusements was contemptuous. His criticisms of Russian women, whom he wished to study, more than once made Vronsky crimson with indignation. The chief reason why the prince was so particularly disagreeable to Vronsky was that he could not help seeing himself in him, and what he saw in this mirror did not gratify his self-esteem. He was a very stupid and very self-satisfied and very healthy and very well-washed man, and nothing else. He was a gentleman, that was true, and Vronsky could not deny it. He was equable and not cringing with his superiors, was free and ingratiating in his behavior with his equals, and was contemptuously indulgent with his inferiors. Vronsky was himself the same, and regarded it as a great merit to be so. But for this prince he was an inferior, and his contemptuous and indulgent attitude to him revolted him. Brainless beef! Can I be like that? He thought. Be that as it might, when on the 7th day he parted from the prince, who was starting for Moscow, and received his thanks, he was happy to be rid of his uncomfortable position and the unpleasant reflection of himself. He said good-bye to him at the station on their return from a bear hunt, at which they had had a display of Russian prowess kept up all night. Chapter 2. When he got home, Vronsky found there a note from Anna. She wrote, "I am ill and unhappy. I cannot come out, but I cannot go on longer without seeing you. Come in this evening. Alexey Alexandrovitch goes to the council at 7 and will be there till 10. Thinking for an instant of the strangeness of her bidding him to come straight to her, in spite of her husband's insisting on her not receiving him, he decided to go. Vronsky had that winter got his promotion, was now a colonel, had left the regimental quarters and was living alone. After having some lunch, he lay down on the sofa immediately, and in 5 minutes memories of the hideous scenes he had witnessed during the last few days were confused together and joined onto a mental image of Anna and of the peasant who had played an important part in the bear hunt, and Vronsky fell asleep. He waked up in the dark, trembling with horror, and made haste to light a candle. What was it? What? What was the dreadful thing I dreamed? Yes. I think a little dirty man with a dishevelled beard was stooping down doing something, and all of a sudden he began saying some strange words in French. Yes, there was nothing else in the dream, he said to himself. But why was it so awful? He vividly recalled the peasant again, and those incomprehensible French words the peasant had uttered, and a chill of horror ran down his spine. What nonsense, thought Vronsky, and glanced at his watch. It was 8:30 already. He rang up his servant, dressed in haste, and went out onto the steps, completely forgetting the dream and only worried at being late. As he drove up to the Karenins' entrance, he looked at his watch and saw it was 10 minutes to 9. A high, narrow carriage with a pair of greys was standing at the entrance. He recognized Anna's carriage. She is coming to me, thought Vronsky, and better she should. I don't like going into that house. But no matter. I can't hide myself, he thought, and with that manner peculiar to him from childhood, as of a man who has done nothing to be ashamed of, Vronsky got out of his sledge and went to the door. The door opened, and the hall porter with a rug on his arm called the carriage. Vronsky, though he did not usually notice details, noticed at this moment the amazed expression with which the porter glanced at him. In the very doorway, Vronsky almost ran up against Alexey Alexandrovitch. The gas jet threw its full light on the bloodless, sunken face under the black hat and on the white cravat, brilliant against the beaver of the coat. Karenin's fixed, dull eyes were fastened upon Vronsky's face. Vronsky bowed, and Alexey Alexandrovitch, chewing his lips, lifted his hand to his hat and went on. Vronsky saw him without looking round get into the carriage, pick up the rug and the opera glass at the window, and disappear. Vronsky went into the hall. His brows were scowling and his eyes gleamed with a proud and angry light in them. What a position, he thought. If he would fight, would stand up for his honor, I could act, express my feelings, but this weakness or baseness, he puts me in the position of playing false, which I never meant and never mean to do. Vronsky's ideas had changed since the day of his conversation with Anna in the Vrede garden. Unconsciously yielding to the weakness of Anna, who had surrendered herself up to him utterly and simply looked to him to decide her fate, ready to submit to anything, he had long ceased to think that their tie might end as he had thought then. His ambitious plans had retreated into the background again, and feeling that he had got out of that circle of activity in which everything was definite, he had given himself entirely to his passion, and that passion was binding him more and more closely to her. He was still in the hall when he caught the sound of her retreating footsteps. He knew she had been expecting him, had listened for him, and was now going back into the drawing-room. "No," she cried on seeing him, and at the first sound of her voice the tears came into her eyes. No, if things are to go on like this, the end will come much, much too soon. What is it, dear one? What? I've been waiting in agony for an hour, 2 hours. No, I won't. I can't quarrel with you. Of course you couldn't come. No, I won't. She laid her 2 hands on his shoulders and looked a long while at him with a profound, passionate, and at the same time searching look. She was studying his face to make up for the time she had not seen him. She was, every time she saw him, making the picture of him in her imagination, incomparably superior, impossible in reality, fit with him as he really was. Chapter 3. You met him? She asked, when they had sat down at the table in the lamplight. You're punished, you see, for being late. Yes, but how was it? Wasn't he to be at the council? He had been and come back, and was going out somewhere again. But that's no matter. Don't talk about it. Where have you been? With the prince still? She knew every detail of his existence. He was going to say that he had been up all night and had dropped asleep, but looking at her thrilled and rapturous face he was ashamed, and he said he had had to go to report on the prince's departure. But it's over now. He is gone. Thank God it's over. You wouldn't believe how insufferable it's been for me. Why so? Isn't it the life all of you, all young men, always lead? She said, knitting her brows, and taking up the crochet work that was lying on the table, she began drawing the hook out of it without looking at Vronsky. I gave up that life long ago, said he, wondering at the change in her face and trying to divine its meaning. And I confess, he said with a smile, showing his thick white teeth, this week I've been, as it were, looking at myself in a glass, seeing that life, and I didn't like it. She held the work in her hands but did not crochet, and looked at him with strange, shining and hostile eyes. This morning Lisa came to see me. They're not afraid to call on me in spite of the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, she put in. And she told me about your Athenian evening. How loathsome. I was just going to say, she interrupted him. It was that Therese you used to know? I was just saying. How disgusting you are, you men. How is it you can't understand that a woman can never forget that, she said, getting more and more angry, and so letting him see the cause of her irritation. Especially a woman who cannot know your life. What do I know? What have I ever known, she said. What you tell me. How do I know whether you tell me the truth? Anna, you hurt me. Don't you trust me? Haven't I told you that I haven't a thought I wouldn't lay bare to you? Yes, yes, she said, evidently trying to suppress her jealous thoughts. But if only you knew how wretched I am. I believe you. I believe you. What were you saying? But he could not at once recall what he had been going to say. These fits of jealousy, which of late had been more and more frequent with her, horrified him, and however much he tried to disguise the fact, made him feel cold to her, although he knew the cause of her jealousy was her love for him. How often he had told himself that her love was happiness, and now she loved him as a woman can love when love has outweighed for her all the good things of life, and he was much further from happiness than when he had followed her from Moscow. Then he had thought himself unhappy, but happiness was before him. Now he felt that the best happiness was already left behind. She was utterly unlike what she had been when he first saw her. Both morally and physically she had changed for the worse. She had broadened out all over, and in her face at the time when she was speaking of the actress there was an evil expression of hatred that distorted it. He looked at her as a man looks at a faded flower he has gathered, with difficulty recognizing in it the beauty for which he picked and ruined it. And in spite of this, he felt that then, when his love was stronger, He could, if he had greatly wished it, have torn that love out of his heart. But now, when as at that moment it seemed to him he felt no love for her, he knew that what bound him to her could not be broken. Well, what was it you were going to say about the prince? I have driven away the fiend," she added. The fiend was the name they had given her jealousy. "What did you begin to tell me about the prince? Why did you find it so tiresome?" "Oh, it was intolerable," he said, trying to pick up the thread of his interrupted thought. "He does not improve on closer acquaintance. If you want him defined, here he is. A prime, well-fed beast, such as takes medals at the cattle shows, and nothing more," he said with a tone of vexation that interested her. "No. How so?" she replied. "He's seen a great deal. Anyway, he's cultured." "It's an utterly different culture, their culture. He's cultivated, one sees, simply to be able to despise culture, as they despise everything but animal pleasures." "But don't you all care for these animal pleasures?" she said, and again he noticed a dark look in her eyes that avoided him. "How is it you're defending him?" he said, smiling. "I'm not defending him. It's nothing to me. But I imagine if you had not cared for those pleasures yourself, you might have got out of them. But if it affords you satisfaction to gaze at Thérèse in the attire of Eve—" "Again, the devil again," Vronsky said, taking the hand she had laid on the table and kissing it. "Yes, but I can't help it. You don't know what I have suffered waiting for you. I believe I'm not jealous. I'm not jealous. I believe you when you're here, but when you're away somewhere leading your life, so incomprehensible to me." She turned away from him, pulled the hook at last out of the crochet work, and rapidly, with the help of her forefinger, began working loop after loop of the wool that was dazzling white in the lamplight, while the slender wrist moved swiftly, nervously in the embroidered cuff. "How was it, then? Where did you meet Alexey Alexandrovitch?" Her voice sounded in an unnatural and jarring tone. "We ran up against each other in the doorway." "And he bowed to you like this?"